Welcome to Inside the Mask, the podcast where we cover off all your favorite horror movies with a true crime twist. Today we'll be looking at the end of the Sawyer family legacy and the conclusion to the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre timeline. It's the story of a young couple traveling across the Texas countryside who, after falling victim to an intense incident of road rage, find themselves caught in a mind-bending and murderous circumstance, featuring appearances from the extended cannibalistic Sawyer family and the return of a certain presumed dead chainsaw-wielding killer. I'm your host, Evan Taggart, and this is Leatherface, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3. The events of what many consider to be the second documented Texas Chainsaw Massacre culminated at Texas Battleland Amusement Park in Red River, 1986. From the horrors of this dilapidated crime scene that would unearth near countless murder victims, two sole survivors would emerge. One was a victim, identified as local radio DJ Vanita Brock, while the other was a member of the murderous, cannibalistic Sawyer family. But identifying this surviving killer would prove to be a complicated task. In the months following the bloody events in Red River, this single surviving member of the Sawyer family was tried in the court of law for, among other macabre crimes, an undisclosed count of murders in the first degree. Now, at this point, the Texas Chainsaw Killings had gained some substantial notoriety in the media, and due to the highly sensationalized nature of the murders, the courts imposed a publication ban on the trial itself, which heavily limited public access to court documents and events that transpired during the trial. However, records do show that the prosecution put a name to this surviving member of the murderous Sawyer family and recorded the killer's name as none other than Walter Edward Sawyer. Now, for those familiar with our previous coverage, Walter Edward, or W.E. as he's often referred to, had not been named a person of interest in either of the Texas Chainsaw murder cases, nor did police or any witnesses mention this individual in impact statements, interviews, or really reports of any kind. From the limited court documents available, it appears that criminal defense for the accused claimed that W.E. Sawyer suffered from multiple personality disorder, and when he put on the human skin masks he'd fashioned from his victims, he would activate his alternate persona of the infamous killer Leatherface. Now, this may have been presented by the defense as a means to spare W.E. Sawyer the death penalty and instead enter an insanity plea, but the jury wasn't so easily convinced, and his subsequent conviction and swiftly processed execution further complicates the process of actually identifying who W.E. Sawyer really was. It's often assumed that this Walter Edward Sawyer was an alias provided by none other than Robert Sawyer, the maniacal killer known as Chop Top, most likely in an attempt to conceal the actual identity and possible whereabouts of his brother Bubba Sawyer, who we now know was the real Leatherface and whose story was far from finished. It was a muddled and messy court case, but with this W.E. Sawyer tried and executed, in the eyes of the prosecution, the case was closed. The maniacal chainsaw killer Leatherface was now dead, and the public could sleep well knowing that the Sawyer family that terrorized Texas for over 14 years was all but gone. But this peace of mind would be short-lived, and soon enough, the real Leatherface and his extended Sawyer family would once again cast a murderous shadow over the state of Texas, one last time. It's now summertime 1990, a mere 4 years after the conclusion of the Texas Chainsaw trial, and local authorities near Denison, Texas have made yet another grisly discovery just off the interstate. In a dried-up pond bed, which was initially thought to be the ruins of an old cemetery, police discovered the decayed and mutilated remains of several human corpses, buried in what appears to be some kind of mass grave. Due to the various states of decomposition across the bodies, a special forensics team is brought in to identify cause of death, and reports conclude that damage to the remains is similar to another murder site across the county, which was also found to be a mass grave. Forensics estimates a total of 40 to 50 bodies present at the crime scene, revealing a ghastly and seemingly long-hidden string of potential murders in the state. Now, the discovery of this gravesite has sent the highway itself into a full closure, where traveling couple and future murder victims Michelle and Ryan are traversing their way from Los Angeles, California, all the way to their family in Florida. In spite of being stopped at a police blockade near the site, they're able to continue their journey another 10 miles down the interstate, where they make a stop to fill up at Last Chance Gas, an establishment offering both full-serve gasoline and mechanic services off the highway. It was a stop that would alter the course of their lives, at a location that would later become a potential crime scene. Impact statements indicate that during her initial interactions with the gas station attendant, Michelle very quickly found this individual to be aggressive and highly agitated, including obvious and often heated sexually charged advances towards her. Now at this point, Ryan has entered the gas station to use the facilities, so Michelle finds herself alone, and she doesn't want to risk further upsetting this new aggressor. He's shouting obscenities to her from outside the car that are becoming angrier, and he really does seem mentally unstable, so she instead tries to remove herself from the situation entirely, possibly in an attempt to reunite with Ryan inside, and she steps out of the vehicle where she runs into another stranger, identified at the time as Tex, but who would later take on a far more prominent role in the new Texas Chainsaw Murders. Now, according to Michelle's witness statements, her initial impressions of Tex were very positive. He presented himself as polite, he was generous, and even chivalrous, descriptors that would ultimately prove deceptive, but in the moment, Tex strikes up a casual conversation where he identifies that he's simply hoping to hitch a ride to the nearby Rosedale, Texas. However, a short time later, tensions at Last Chance gas station would ultimately escalate quickly. While using the run-down gas station bathroom, Michelle hears a commotion outside and rejoins Ryan at the vehicle to discover a physical altercation between Tex and the gas station attendant. Reports indicate that the altercation was spurred by the possible discovery that the attendant had been, rather disturbingly, spying on Michelle as she used the facilities, which later crime scene photos confirm with the discovery of a crude peephole in the gas station walls. Things take a turn for the worst here when the attendant becomes even more agitated with these accusations, and after making a run back into the gas station itself, he emerges, brandishing a shotgun. Now, obviously terrified, Michelle and Ryan get back into the vehicle and speed away down the road. They narrowly escape this crazed gunman as he takes aim and fires his shotgun in their direction, which damaged the back window and completely shatters the glass. According to statements, Michelle reports that it was Ryan that says he witnessed Tex possibly murdered in the distance or injured, seemingly being shot by the attendant. And it was also Ryan who, in a sheer moment of panic, suggests to take an unmarked back road in their escape, possibly hoping to break line of sight in the event that the pair might be pursued. And if they had simply stuck to their planned route, if they had traveled down the interstate or, quite frankly, any other direction, they may have actually avoided the nightmare that was to follow. Now, later on in the evening, in what he would later describe as a whirlwind of pure chance, driving down this very same back road is an ex-military veteran named Benny. Post-investigation police interviews indicate that Benny is on his way to a survivalist camp out in the desert hills to meet up with some friends, as he did every few weekends, where they would gather and sharpen up on their military-based skills. His weekend plans would change drastically when, from out of nowhere, Benny sees a set of headlights up ahead, only they're veering straight towards his vehicle. Narrowly avoiding a head-on collision, Benny swerves out of the way, sending his car careening into a nearby ditch. And despite suffering a minor head injury, he emerges from the crash and, likely activating his survival instincts, sets out to locate the other vehicle, which he discovers has horrifically crashed off the side of the road and tumbled all the way down a nearby hillside. Now, Benny isn't expecting anyone to be alive at this point. The crash looks considerably bad, and from a distance, the driver of the vehicle seems to be possibly deceased. But to his surprise, someone emerges from the passenger side of the vehicle. It's Ryan, alive but bleeding from the head. The situation further improves when Benny discovers that the driver, who is Michelle, is in fact alive after all. She's unconscious, but she's breathing. Now, using a first aid kit that he has in his Jeep, Benny's able to nurse both of these individuals back to health. But as he's doing so, they tell him a story that in the moment sounds too crazy to be true. This panicked couple tells him that before the crash, they were just attacked somewhere up the road. And even crazier, it was by a masked maniac wielding a chainsaw. Now, Benny doesn't initially believe this story. He chalks it up to delirium or confusion. I mean, these two individuals suffered obvious head trauma in the crash, and they also just consumed 2 painkillers from his first aid kit, which is sometimes known to cause confusion or grogginess. But a closer inspection of the crashed vehicle is enough to change his mind. The car has damage from the crash, no doubt, but also some curious markings. Markings that look like they came from some kind of serrated saw blade, a statement confirmed by police reports when the vehicle was eventually recovered as evidence. Michelle and Ryan are in complete panic mode right now. They've just experienced a series of intense trauma, and if their story is to be believed, a terrifying attack at the hands of a newly emerged Leatherface killer. And as reported by Michelle herself, she swears that right before the crash she thinks she saw another man on the road, and that it looked just like an injured Tex from the gas station. But Benny isn't so easily rattled. Utilizing his experience, he's able to keep a level head, and after reassuring the injured parties, he heads back up to the roadside to salvage what he can from his Jeep and possibly look for this injured Tex individual. Now, Benny was not known to travel light, particularly on his weekend getaways, and he kept a loaded AR-18 assault rifle in the cab of his vehicle, the same weapon that would later be located and recovered from the Sawyer murder house, with a serial number registered to Benny himself. However, the journey back to the Jeep is not a straight shot, and back up on the dirt road, Benny crosses paths with Tinker Sawyer, a sadistic but seemingly calculated member of the family who operated under the ruse of a tow truck driver, seemingly stopping by to help at the scene of the crash. Now, it's important to note that the relation between most of the Sawyer family in general here is heavily debated among experts. From the bodies recovered at the massacre site, DNA testing does link Tinker to the Sawyer bloodline directly, and to that of both Edward Sawyer and the elder matriarch Ann Sawyer, who we'll get to shortly. It's heavily theorized that Edward and Tinker were brothers, and likely the sons of Ann Sawyer, but it's ultimately unclear if Bubba Sawyer had the same relation as a sibling, or if they were in fact extended family, possibly cousins. In addition, the Sawyer family was reported to have experienced generational inbreeding, which makes the practice of formally identifying their relations even more difficult. Medical records also indicate that the elder Ann Sawyer experienced a seemingly self-inflicted sterilization at some point, rendering her unable to bear future children, which may or may not indicate that she was more likely Leatherface's aunt. At the roadside, Benny's able to see through Tinker's false persona, and later reported that he was tipped off by the sight of a chainsaw in the tow truck bed. Though Benny is able to feign ignorance for just enough time to gather his rifle, he manages to barely leap out of the way of Tinker's vehicle as it speeds towards him in an attempt to kill him. He would then come face to face with the killer from Ryan and Michelle's story. Leatherface himself has caught up. At the sight of this chainsaw-wielding behemoth, Benny says that a switch in him just flips, and using his combat training, he's able to fight off his attacker, escaping only with minor injuries. Now, Michelle and Ryan have been waiting at the vehicle for what seems like hours, and there's no sign of Benny or Tex or any other help coming for them. So they set off into the woods hoping to find someone, anyone who can get them out of this horrific situation, but ultimately fall victim to a trap, this time quite literally. Investigators responding to the Sawyer house reported that the woods surrounding the home were heavily secured with various homemade traps, ranging from the counterweight-activated lethal variety to pressure-activated snares. And in the chaotic journey through these woods, the young couple fails to notice one of these contraptions. And Michelle is startled by Ryan's cries as he is snared by the steel jaws of a bear trap. As she frantically scrambles to release him, Leatherface suddenly emerges from the tree line and immediately sets upon them with his chainsaw. In spite of her efforts to free Ryan, Michelle is unable to do so, and he is killed by what autopsy reports as one deep and severe laceration that enters his sternum and travels all the way down to his pelvis. Conflicting reports from Michelle's later accounts indicate that Ryan may have survived this attack, but medical experts tend to agree that the physical trauma, partnered with no doubt extensive internal and external blood loss, would have made Ryan succumb to his injuries almost immediately, and it's very unlikely that he survived the travel back to the Sawyer house for consumption. As Michelle runs further and further into the woods, she hears the roar of Leatherface's chainsaw. She has no idea where she's going or what she's going to find, but sheer adrenaline is keeping her on her feet at this point, and up ahead, she sees a glimmer of hope. Just past the tree line, Michelle sees a house, and it looks like someone might be home. Now, who that would be would end up being worse than Michelle could have possibly imagined. Crime scene photographs from the Sawyer residence show a similar state of disrepair to the previous Sawyer family hideouts, complete with rooms littered with both human and animal bones, and interestingly, a room containing various radio equipment, theorized to have been used to both pick up transmissions of nearby travelers and/or police, as well as by the Sawyers themselves, likely to communicate with one another and better coordinate their attacks or ambushes. When Michelle first enters the house, she thinks she's found her safe haven, where she meets what seems to be the sole occupant. It's a little girl, probably no older than 8 or 9 years old. Now you have to think here, Michelle has just barged into the house and is covered in blood and screaming, so she's now engaging with a small child who, at this point, seems to be understandably terrified. And so Michelle decides to take a gentle approach in asking for help. The reality sets in pretty quickly, however, when this seemingly innocent little girl reveals her true colors and proceeds to successfully stab Michelle with some kind of crudely fashioned knife. Now, there's a few different theories to the identity of this child, and though her eventual probable integration into either foster care or a mental institution would see her name change, initial police reports name her as Bobby Sawyer. Now, some theorize that Bobby may have been a one-time victim herself, possibly adopted by the murderous family as a young child after her actual family was killed. But another more likely possibility is far more disturbing and seemingly corroborated by Michelle's own accounts of conversations with the Sawyers later that evening. It's possible that Bobby Sawyer was not abducted, but rather that she was the biological daughter of none other than Bubba Sawyer himself, the masked killer, Leatherface. Now, there's no DNA evidence on record to support this, but for those familiar with the prior case coverage, Leatherface began showcasing various behaviors, correlating to his own sexual frustrations and intimate desires towards prior surviving victim, Vanita Brock, and this was during the Red River murders in 1986. Behavioral analysts often suspect that these new patterns would have likely escalated and manifested more so in the ensuing years. It's theorized then that Bobby Sawyer may have been the offspring of Leatherface acting on these internal desires, and likely with one of his victims. Now, disturbingly, police reports indicate that among the immense tally of bodies recovered from the Sawyer property and the surrounding swamps, there was at least one set of skeletal remains belonging to that of an infant child. And while some argue this could be yet another victim, others claim that it may support another failed childbirth attempt on account of Leatherface's possible sexual assaults. Now, back at the Sawyer house, Michelle is further surprised as she's grabbed by an unseen assailant who reveals himself to be none other than Tex, in reality, the deranged Edward Sawyer, who has now revealed his own true murderous persona. As is often custom with victims of the Sawyer murders, Michelle is soon seated at a sprawling dinner table, where she finally comes face to face with the rest of the extended Sawyer family. At the dinner table, Michelle is introduced to the matriarch of this psychotic family, the previously mentioned Ann Sawyer, who is wheelchair-bound and was found to have communicated through an electronic speaking apparatus inserted into her trachea. Interestingly, also seated at the table is the body of Grandpa Sawyer, whose corpse was previously recovered from the Red River crime scene in 1986 and may have been somehow stolen by the surviving Sawyer members in the subsequent years. Michelle is horrified as Edward and Tinker drag in the body of Ryan, who, again, according to conflicting witness statements, may or may not have been alive at the time. Either way, Ryan is strung up to what crime scene photos showcase as some kind of meat hook contraption, complete with a lever-release hammer system of some kind. Ryan's body was ultimately found to be hanging upside down on this device in the kitchen area of the house, suffering from, in addition to the aforementioned chainsaw trauma to his torso, a single major blow to the head. Blood samples confirmed to be Ryan's were also found on the hammer that was attached to the macabre contraption, indicating that whether he was dead or alive, the device was used to fracture Ryan's skull. Now, Michelle can only watch on in horror at this point as she, quite disturbingly, has been physically nailed to her chair, confirmed by puncture wounds to both of her palms. And as Leatherface starts up his chainsaw, as he inches the blade closer and closer to Michelle, chaos suddenly erupts. Michelle says that her initial thoughts in the moment were that she was hearing fireworks, or perhaps that the chainsaw was malfunctioning or loudly stalling. She soon realizes, however, that what she's hearing is gunfire. Now, rewinding a little bit here to Benny, his impact statement indicates that after recovering from the earlier attack, he wandered the woods looking for Ryan and Michelle, having discovered them to be missing from the vehicle crash site. In his travels, he encountered what he described as a demented individual, a man later identified as none other than Alfredo Sawyer, who was also ID'd by Michelle as the man who was operating the Last Chance gas station, a major indicator as to just how far the Sawyer family would go to set up their ruse and to ambush unsuspecting victims. Reports indicate that Alfredo was seemingly dumping human remains and body parts from his pickup truck into a nearby swamp bog that the Sawyer family had behind the property. The same site which dozens of bodies in various states of decomposition were later found. It's heavily theorized that this bog was used for parts that were unfit for cannibalistic consumption, and after a brief altercation, Benny is able to subdue this crazed Sawyer by knocking him unconscious, and it doesn't take long for Benny to follow the trail of chaotic sounds echoing nearby, all the way back to the Sawyer residence, where, after witnessing the grisly dinner scene from the window, he wastes no time opening fire with his AR-18 assault rifle. Now, ballistics recovered a total of 30 expended rounds of 45mm ammunition from outside the Sawyer house, indicating that Benny fired every last bullet from the magazine that was loaded into the rifle. It's possible, though not confirmed, that Benny either didn't see Michelle in the room from the shooting angle or that he might have assumed that Michelle was already dead when he opened fire. The ensuing gunfire would result in numerous casualties. Ann Sawyer was hit a total of 3 times. The final fatal round pierced her chest cavity and severed her aorta, killing her almost instantly. Tinker Sawyer was also killed in the assault, his body found to have numerous gunshot trauma wounds, including the partial removal of his hand and his ear, which was disturbingly found nearby on the stovetop. Miraculously, or some might argue might be the result of Benny's trained aim and shooting abilities, Michelle is unharmed in the shooting, and she uses her no doubt spiked adrenaline to her advantage. She escapes her bindings, and though initially intercepted by a surviving Edward Sawyer, she's able to make a run for the front door after she successfully stabs Edward with a knife from the nearby kitchen block. Now, outside the house, Michelle reunites with Benny, where they're able to attempt to flee, but once again are confronted by the 2 remaining Sawyer killers. Leatherface, who sets off after Michelle as she runs off into the woods, and Edward, who now comes face to face with Benny out on the driveway. The two engage in a physical confrontation, and Edward Sawyer is ultimately killed when he inadvertently is doused with gasoline from a nearby damaged vehicle, and then subsequently lit on fire by Benny himself. Autopsy reports confirm this as they showcase third and second degree burns to the vast majority of Edward Sawyer's body. Now, Michelle has escaped into the nearby bog, and in a desperate attempt to conceal herself, she's able to hide among the bodies of the dead within the swamp itself. Her hiding spot doesn't last, however, and shortly after, she's discovered by the pursuing Leatherface. Just as all hope for Michelle seems lost and she's under the impression that she's about to die, she is suddenly saved by Benny, who emerges from the darkness and tackles Leatherface into the swamp. As the two men battle over Leatherface's roaring chainsaw, Michelle can do nothing but watch, and while Benny seems to have the upper hand at first, he soon falls to Bubba Sawyer, who manages to subdue Benny with a well-placed slash to the head. With Benny seemingly dead, Leatherface turns his attention back to Michelle, but Michelle is done being the victim. She feels the killer's strong grasp at her flesh as he attempts to pull her into the bog, but Michelle's hand finds a weapon of her own, a jagged rock laying nearby. In her desperate survival instinct, she blindly swings the rock and connects directly with Leatherface's skull. Now, Michelle is unsure of how many times exactly that she struck Bubba Sawyer with this rock, as she reports the event seemed to almost happen in accelerated time, no doubt a result of the intense adrenaline and shock. And after one final blow, and what she described as a sickening crack, Bubba Sawyer's body goes limp, and the last vision that Michelle has of the maniacal chainsaw killer known as Leatherface is his body sinking into the swamp, along with his still-spinning chainsaw and the remains of so many of the Sawyer family victims. Michelle's recollection of events following the massacre at the Sawyer house are spotty at best. She reports running and running until she felt like her body would collapse in on itself, and at some point, she finds herself wandering the Texas roadside in the hours of the early morning. Michelle says that her heart nearly stopped when a vehicle pulls up next to her, brandishing the logo of the Last Chance gas station. Her fears are quelled, however, when the door opens to reveal it's none other than Benny, the other surviving victim of the third Texas Chainsaw murders. According to statements in medical records, Benny suffered from a deep laceration to his forehead, which rendered him momentarily unconscious back at the swamp, but he was able to escape shortly thereafter and retrace his steps back to Alfredo's pickup truck, which was still parked on the property, which he then used to flee the grounds. But it wouldn't be a happy ending just yet. The reunion would suffer a brief interlude. A crazed and aggressive Alfredo Sawyer attacks Benny one more time after emerging from his hiding spot in the truck bed, where he was assumed to have been hiding during the gunfire and the chaos at the Sawyer family residence. And though Alfredo proceeds to violently attack Michelle next, she's able to subdue him, ironically using his own shotgun he kept in the cab of the vehicle. Forensics conclude that Alfredo Sawyer was killed with a single short-range blast to the torso, his body later recovered from the Texas roadside by police. There were 3 confirmed survivors of the third Texas Chainsaw Massacre. This time, 2 of them were victims, and as such, the events of the murders themselves proved to be much easier to corroborate than with previous cases that only had 1 survivor. This eliminates a lot of the speculation that is typically associated with other Sawyer family murder cases. The third survivor was Bobby Sawyer, who was rumored to have been placed into police custody and possibly foster care, though other sources point to possible institutionalization. In the highly publicized investigation into this latest set of murders, it seemed that the horrific grasp that the Sawyer family held over Texas for nearly 20 years was at an end. There's no official count of how many victims were on site at these Sawyer grounds. Police recovered the bodies of the deceased Sawyer family members as well as the remains of countless victims spread across the house itself and the nearby swamp. But there was one body missing from the records tallying the dead, and that was the body of Bubba Sawyer himself. Investigation documents seem to suggest that police assume that his body sunk deep into the bog, making recovery nearly impossible. But many wonder if it is possible that Leatherface in fact survived this latest string of violent events, and if the Sawyer family legacy might live on after all. Thanks for listening to our true crime spin on Leatherface, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3. As always, if you enjoyed the episode, please make sure to like, share, subscribe, all that fun stuff. We really appreciate it. This concludes the original timeline of the Sawyer family legacy. Originally, the plan was to cover the first 2 films, but it didn't really feel right to not tell the entire story. Plus, my friend Eric reminded me that it's the 50th anniversary of the franchise this year, so thanks, Eric. Though the follow-up to this sequel, titled The Next Generation, is still technically considered to be part of the original timeline, the family in that movie is renamed to the Slaughter family, and it really doesn't have anything to do with these other films in terms of continuity. Also, it performed so poorly, both commercially and critically, that it caused the studio to put the entire franchise on ice for almost 10 years, where it would eventually be rebooted and start an all-new timeline of reboot films. I might cover those off one day, but for now, we're leaving Texas behind and heading on down the road to Haddonfield. But before we get there, we'll be making a quick stop next week at a little town called Springwood. And that's all for this episode. Once again, I'm your host, Evan Taggart, and this has been Inside the Mask.